The wind had no kindness in it. It was a dry, rasping thing that scraped across the plains, carrying the taste of dust and 100 miles of nothing. It worried the brittle branches of the cottonwoods huddled by the riverbed and whispered through the sun-bleached skeletons of last year's grass. The earth itself was cracked, a web of fissures spreading across the hardpan as if the land were thirsting to death. This was a place where things came to end. Eli Carter felt a kinship with it. He rode with his shoulders slumped. A weariness settled deep in his bones that had nothing to do with the long miles. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Dust, dropped its head, its sides heaving with effort. They had been moving since before dawn, chasing the pale memory of a sunrise that had offered no warmth. Now, with the sun burning high and white in a cloudless sky, the heat was a physical weight. Grief was a shadow that rode with him, a constant companion that cooled the sun's heat and deadened the world's colors. It lived in the quiet set of his jaw and the hollows beneath his eyes. It was a ghost that touched his left shoulder sometimes, a phantom ache that had nothing to do with the puckered scar hidden beneath his worn chambray shirt. That scar was from a gunfight, a straightforward piece of violence he could understand, even if he did not speak of it. The other wound, the one that had no scar, was a deeper, more complicated hurt. It was the reason he was here, riding through the heart of nowhere, heading for no place in particular. The river was little more than a suggestion, a sluggish brown ribbon of water carving a slow path through the desolation. The banks were soft mud, pocked with the tracks of deer and coyote. It was enough. He would make camp here, let the horse drink its fill and graze on what little green clung to the water's edge. He swung down from the saddle, his joints protesting with a dull fire. Every movement was deliberate, economical. He unsaddled Dust, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man whose life was a series of familiar, repetitive tasks. He led the horse to the water, then set about gathering the sparse firewood that littered the ground, dry, twisted pieces of mesquite and deadfall from the skeletal trees. As he knelt by the river's edge to fill his canteen, he saw them. They were faint, half filled with water and beginning to lose their shape, but they were unmistakable. The tracks of a human foot, a small foot, slender, with a high arch, a woman's foot, and it was bare. A knot of caution tightened in his gut. A lone woman, barefoot, in this unforgiving country. It was a recipe for trouble. She was either a fool or desperate, or both. His first instinct was to ignore it. He had enough trouble of his own. He was not looking to take on anyone else's. He had learned the hard way that trying to save people only got you burned. He stood, wiping his wet hand on his denims, and looked around. The plain stretched out empty in all directions. There was no sign of a camp, no wagon, no other horse, just the lonely wind and the slow-moving water. The tracks led away from the river, heading downstream toward a dense thicket of salt cedar and willow. He told himself to let it be, mount up and ride on, find another place to camp, a place free of barefoot women and the trouble they courted. But he did not move. The image of those small, vulnerable tracks in the mud snagged on something inside him. A rusty hook of conscience he thought had long since been filed smooth. He thought of another woman, of her small hands, and the way she'd looked at him with such trust, a trust he had failed. With a low curse that the wind snatched away, Eli turned and followed the tracks. He moved quietly, his hand resting on the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was not a man who trusted easily, and this land did not reward sentiment. The tracks were harder to follow once they left the soft mud of the bank, but he found them again in a patch of sand, and then where a heel had dug into the dry earth. They led him into the thicket, where the air grew still and heavy. The sound of the river was muffled here, replaced by the drone of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. He found her huddled at the base of a gnarled willow tree, half hidden by its drooping branches. She was a wretched sight. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with a thick layer of filth. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark brown knots, matted with leaves and twigs. She was shivering, though the air was warm. Her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if trying to hold herself together. Her feet were caked in mud, scratched and bleeding. On her wrists, stark against the grime on her skin, were the raw, red welts of rope burns. She did not hear him approach. She was staring at nothing, her eyes wide and vacant with a terror that seemed to have burned everything else away. Eli stopped a few feet from her, making no sudden moves. He had seen that look before, on spooked horses and on men who had seen too much fighting. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. The sound shattered the stillness. She flinched violently, scrambling backward, pressing herself against the rough bark of the willow. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, focused on him, and the vacant terror was replaced by a sharp, immediate fear. She looked from his face to the gun at his hip and back again. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, keeping his voice level. He held his hands out, away from his body, palms open. "Just saw your tracks. Wondered if you were in need of help." "Help!" The words seemed to break something in her. Her face crumpled, but she caught the sob before it could take voice. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. "No, no, please." Her voice was a ragged whisper. "Do not take me back. Please, mister, I am begging you, do not take me back to town." The plea hung in the air between them. He had expected her to ask for food, or water, or protection. Not this. "What town?" he asked, his suspicion hardening. "Harmony Creek," she breathed. "They will kill me. I swear to God, they will." Eli knew of Harmony Creek. It was a hardscrabble cattle town 2 days' ride back the way he had come, a place with a reputation for quick tempers and frontier justice. He looked at her again, at the rope burns and the terror in her eyes. Trouble. He had been right. This was a whole world of it, gift-wrapped in a torn dress. "Why would they want to kill you?" he asked, his tone flat. Betraying nothing. She hesitated, her gaze darting around as if expecting men with ropes and torches to burst from the trees at any moment. They say I did something terrible." "Did you?" Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time he saw a spark of defiance flare within the fear. "No, I did not." He did not believe her. He did not disbelieve her either. He had no stake in her story. All he saw was a complication he did not need. Leaving her here, though, he looked at her bare, bruised feet, at the way her thin frame shook. The coyotes would find her before the next sunrise. His conscience, that rusty hook, dug a little deeper. "I'm camping for the night," he said, turning back toward the river. "By the water. You can share my fire if you've a mind to. Get some warmth in you." He did not wait for an answer. He walked away, leaving the choice to her. If she followed, she followed. If she stayed hidden in the willows, that was her business. He could not force her, and he would not chase her. He went back to his campsite and began to build a fire, his movements precise and unhurried. He told himself he did not care if she came, but he found himself listening for the sound of footsteps in the grass. It was nearly dusk when she appeared. She moved like a ghost, emerging from the shadows of the thicket and stopping at the edge of the firelight's circle. She stood there, wavering, a lost soul caught between two darknesses. Eli did not look up from the rabbit he was skinning. "There's coffee in the pot," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the small tin pot nestled in the coals. "And a spare cup in my saddlebag." She did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, she crept forward and retrieved the cup. Her hands shook so badly she had to use both of them to pour the coffee, sloshing some of the dark liquid onto the ground. She retreated to the far side of the fire and sat with her knees drawn up, cradling the hot cup as if it were a living thing. They sat in silence for a long time, The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the river. The darkness deepened around them, turning the plains into a vast, black ocean. Eli roasted the rabbit on a spit, the smell of the cooking meat rich in the cool night air. When it was done, he offered her a piece on the tip of his knife. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. She ate like a starving animal, tearing at the meat with her teeth, not stopping until the bone was clean. He let her eat her fill before he spoke again. Folks in Harmony Creek must have a powerful reason for chasing a woman out into the wilderness alone. She stiffened, the piece of meat halfway to her lips. She put it down slowly. They do. You want to tell me what it is? She looked at him across the flickering flames. The firelight carved sharp angles into her face, making her look both older and more vulnerable. My name is Marianne Holt, she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. My husband was Silas Holt. He owned the Double H Ranch, east of town. Eli knew the name. Silas Holt was a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for cruelty. A man who broke horses with a club and men with low wages and a heavy fist. He had been found dead a week ago. The news had traveled fast, as news of a rich man's death always did. They said he fell and hit his head, Eli said, watching her carefully. A drunken accident. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. That was the first story, the one his foreman told the sheriff. But people talk. They knew Silas was not a gentleman. They knew he hurt me. So the story changed. It was not an accident. They decided it was me. The bruised wife finally got her revenge. They said I pushed him, that I cracked his skull with a fireplace poker while he slept. And the rope burns? Eli asked, his gaze falling to her wrists. The foreman, Mr. Grady, and two of the ranch hands, they decided they did not need to wait for the circuit judge. They locked me in the smokehouse while they went to town to stir up a posse. They were going to hang me from the gate of my own ranch. I got out. There was a loose board at the back. I ran. It was a plausible story. Plausible enough. But Eli had been around long enough to know that the most plausible stories were often the most practiced lies. Why should I believe you? He asked, the question blunt as a rock. Marianne Holt looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her green eyes shining with an intensity that startled him. You should not, she said quietly. There is no reason on this earth for you to believe a word I say. I am a stranger, a filthy, half-starved woman accused of murder. But I am telling you the truth. I did not kill my husband. Her voice dropped to a whisper, fierce and raw. But I am not sorry he is dead. The honesty of that last statement struck him harder than any tearful plea for innocence could have. He saw something in her then, something beyond the fear and the dirt. A core of iron, bent but not yet broken. It did not make him believe her. Not entirely. But it made him pause. It made him look at her not as a piece of trouble, but as a person. He said nothing more. He cleaned his knife, banked the fire for the night, and laid out his bedroll on one side of the flames. He took his spare blanket and tossed it across the fire to her. Get some sleep, he said. You look like you need it. He lay down, his hat tilted over his eyes, his gun belt within easy reach. But he did not sleep. He listened to the sounds of the night, to the breathing of his horse, and to the quiet, unsettled movements of the woman on the other side of the fire. He was an idiot for letting her stay, a fool for getting involved. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to get up, kick dirt on the fire, and ride away. But he stayed. He stayed because of the iron in her voice, and because of the memory of a different woman, one who had also looked at him with desperate eyes. Later, in the deepest part of the night, a sound pulled him from a light doze. It was a choked, whimpering cry. He lifted his hat just enough to see. Marianne was sitting up, her arms wrapped around her shins, her body rocking back and forth. She was caught in the grip of a nightmare, her face pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. but she made no sound beyond that first, stifled sob. She was crying as if she had forgotten how, a silent, desperate outpouring of grief or terror, or both. Eli watched her for a long time. The scarred, calloused parts of him wanted to turn away, to ignore her pain as he ignored his own. It was not his concern. He had not invited it, but another part of him, a part he thought long dead and buried, felt a sharp, unwelcome pang of something that might have been pity. He saw not just the accused murderer, but a woman utterly alone, drowning in a sea of darkness. He did not move. He said nothing. He simply lay there and watched until her trembling subsided and she finally lay back down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin, her silent tears leaving clean tracks through the grime on her face. The sun was barely a rumor in the east when he woke. The air was cool and damp, smelling of river water and wet earth. He sat up and saw that the space where Marianne had slept was empty. The blanket lay folded neatly on the ground. For a moment, he felt a strange sense of relief. She was gone. The trouble had moved on. Then he saw her. She was 50 yards away, scrambling up the far side of a shallow ravine. Running, it was not a fast, fluid run, but a clumsy, stumbling flight, her torn dress snagging on the brush. She was trying to get away from him. A weary sigh escaped him. He had not expected gratitude, but he had not expected this either. He got to his feet, not hurrying. She would not get far in her condition. He walked, following her path, the rising sun at his back. He caught up to her easily. She heard him coming and tried to push herself faster, a sob of frustration breaking from her lips. She tripped on a loose rock, falling hard to her knees in the dirt. She tried to get up, but her legs would not obey. She knelt there, panting, defeated. Eli stopped a few feet behind her. "Running away is a poor plan when you do not know where you are running to," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. She did not turn around. Her shoulders shook. "Just leave me be," she gasped, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Let me go." "There is nowhere to go," he said simply. "Out here, alone. You will be dead in 2 days. Thirst will get you if a snake does not. If you are lucky." She finally turned to look at him, pushing a tangled strand of hair from her face. Her eyes were wild with desperation. "It is better than being hanged." "Maybe," he conceded. "Maybe not." He stood there, looking down at her, a broken thing kneeling in the dust, and he was faced with the choice again. Walk away, ride on, leave her to her fate. It was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. He thought of the gallows in Harmony Creek. He thought of her silent tears in the moonlight. He thought of the empty space beside him on his long ride to nowhere. Against his better judgment, against every sensible instinct he possessed, he stepped forward. He reached down, and before she could protest, he hooked one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her from the ground. She was shockingly light, a bundle of sharp bones and trembling muscle. She gave a small cry of surprise, but was too exhausted to struggle. He carried her back to the camp, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the low, rugged hills that rose up in the distance, blue and hazy in the morning light. He set her down gently by the fire, then went to saddle his horse. When dust was ready, he walked back to her. She watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, not knowing what to expect. "The road goes back to Harmony Creek," he said, his voice flat, "and west to more towns like it. They will be looking for you on the road." He looked toward the hills. "That way, there is no road." He held out a hand to her. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. He pulled her to her feet and, without another word, lifted her onto the saddle. He swung up behind her, taking the reins. She was stiff and awkward in front of him, her body held rigid, not touching him more than was necessary. Eli Carter nudged the buckskin forward, turning the horse away from the river, away from the road, and pointed him toward the wild, empty sanctuary of the hills. He did not know what he was doing, or why. He only knew that he was riding away from one town's justice and deeper into a trouble he had never asked for, with a strange, broken woman in his arms. The days that followed bled into one another, each defined by a different kind of misery. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the rocky inclines and sparse grasslands of the hills. The heat baked the earth, and the light was so bright and white it hurt to look at. By midday, sweat traced paths through the grime on their faces, and the air they breathed was hot and thin. Eli rode with his hat pulled low, his eyes narrowed to slits, scanning the terrain for water, for game, for any sign of pursuit. Marianne rode in front of him, her posture a testament to sheer, stubborn endurance. She did not complain. She did not speak at all unless spoken to, and he rarely spoke. The nights were a different torment. As soon as the sun vanished behind the jagged peaks to the west, the heat fled the land, and a deep, penetrating cold crept out of the rocks. It seeped into their bones, making their muscles ache and their teeth chatter. They slept on opposite sides of a meager fire, wrapped in their single blankets, the vast, star-dusted sky pressing down on them like a frozen ceiling. Their silence was a living thing, a third companion on their journey. It was made of the things she would not explain and the questions he refused to ask. He told himself he did not care what really happened in that fine house back in Harmony Creek. He did not care if she had swung the poker or if her husband had simply stumbled. Her past was a hornet's nest, and he had no desire to poke it with a stick. He was not her savior or her judge. He was just a man putting miles between himself and his own ghosts. She was cargo, a complication he had foolishly taken on, and the sooner he could find a place to leave her, the better. And yet, he watched her. He saw the way she gnawed on her lip when she thought he was not looking, the way her hands sometimes clenched into fists for no reason. He saw the deep, abiding weariness in her eyes that went beyond physical exhaustion. He learned the rhythm of her breathing, the slight hitch in it when a sudden noise startled her. He learned that she could ride for 10 hours without a word, and that she ate what little food he gave her with a grim determination, as if fueling a machine she had come to despise. He was not protecting her out of kindness. The realization was a bitter pill he swallowed each morning. Kindness was a luxury, a soft emotion that had died in him years ago, consumed by the flames of a burning barn. He was doing this out of guilt. Each time he looked at Marianne, huddled and broken, he saw Clara. He saw the woman he had loved, the woman whose trust he had held in his hands and let slip through his fingers like sand. He had not been there to save Clara. He had failed her in the most fundamental way a man could fail a woman who depended on him. Now, this strange, silent woman was his penance. He was not saving her. He was trying to save himself from the memory of the one he had lost. On the fourth day, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, and the wind, which had been their constant, abrasive companion, died completely. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the hills. "Storm's coming," Eli said, his first unsolicited words of the day. "A bad one." He urged the horse forward, searching for shelter. They found it an hour later, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It was not much, a massive, ancient pine that had fallen long ago, its huge trunk resting on a bed of rock, creating a hollow space beneath it. It was tight and smelled of damp earth and pine rot, but it was shelter from the deluge that was about to break. He got dust settled under a rocky overhang nearby, then ducked under the log, joining Marianne in the cramped space. The sky opened up. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, gray sheets, hammering the ground and turning the dry creek beds into roaring torrents. Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by cracks of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. They were soaked through. The rain had caught them in the open, and their clothes were plastered to their skin. Water dripped from their hair and ran in rivulets down their faces. Cold settled in, a deep, shivering chill that the small, sputtering fire Eli managed to coax to life could not seem to touch. The space was too small for distance. They sat inches apart, their knees almost touching. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, could smell the scent of rain and wet wool and something else. Something that was uniquely her. The tension that had simmered between them for days now thickened in the close, damp air. It was a wire pulled taut, vibrating with their unspoken thoughts, their mutual distrust, and the undeniable fact of their bodies so close together. He stared into the pathetic fire, feeding it twigs, pretending she was not there. But he was aware of her every movement. He heard the quiet chatter of her teeth, saw the goose flesh on her arms in the flickering firelight. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. It was maddening. He felt a primal urge to pull her against him, to share his warmth, to stop her shivering. He crushed the urge ruthlessly. Touching her would be a mistake. It would be a weakness. It would make this whole impossible situation even more complicated. The dampness from the storm aggravated the old wound in his shoulder. It was a dull, throbbing ache that radiated down his arm, a familiar pain he usually ignored. But tonight, it was a hot coal lodged in his muscle. He shifted, trying to find a position that eased it, and a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped his lips. Marianne's head snapped up, her green eyes, wide and dark in the dim light, fixed on his face. "You are hurt." It was not a question. "It is nothing," he bit out, annoyed at his own weakness. "An old wound." "Let me see," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "No." "You are favoring it. It will only get worse in this cold." Before he could protest again, she shifted closer. "Please, let me just look." He wanted to tell her no, to push her away, but the exhaustion of the last few days, combined with the throbbing pain, wore down his defenses. He gave a short, grudging nod. He turned his back to her slightly and pulled the wet chambray shirt away from his shoulder. Her fingers were gentle as they touched the edge of the old bandage. It was little more than a strip of cloth, soiled and damp. "This needs to be changed," she murmured. She worked carefully, her touch surprisingly steady, and unwrapped the binding. When the scar was exposed, he felt her hesitate. He knew what she was seeing. It was an ugly thing, a puckered, star-shaped scar from a bullet that had shattered the bone. He felt her fingertips trace the edge of it, a touch so light it was like the brush of a moth's wing. He flinched away as if he had been burned. A sharp, violent jerk. That was pure instinct. The touch did not hurt his shoulder. It hurt something much deeper, striking the raw nerve of memory. That scar was a part of Clara's story, a part of his failure. No one had touched it since. Marianne pulled her hand back quickly. "I am sorry," she whispered. He did not answer. He stared into the darkness outside their shelter. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He could feel her presence behind him, the warmth of her, the quiet shame of her apology. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean strip of linen and a small tin of salve. He handed them to her over his shoulder, his movements stiff. She took them without a word. She applied the salve with a delicate touch, her fingers cool on his feverish skin. Then she bound the wound tightly, her work neat and efficient. When she was finished, her hands rested on his shoulders for a fraction of a second before she pulled away. The small act of care left a gaping hole in his defenses. It was an intimacy he had not been prepared for, a quiet moment of vulnerability that changed the texture of the air between them. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the sound of the rain drumming on the log above them, filling the space her touch had left behind. Sometime after midnight, the rain lessened to a steady drizzle. Eli was half asleep, his head propped against the log, when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, the squelch of hooves in mud, the low murmur of men's voices. He was instantly awake. Every muscle tensed. He put a hand on Marianne's arm, and she went rigid. Her eyes were wide with stark terror in the dim light of the dying fire. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the darkness beyond their shelter. The voices grew louder, rough and angry.
She came this way. I tell you, Jedediah saw tracks by the creek 2 days back.
Could be anybody's tracks. An Indian? Maybe. They were small. A woman's. We keep heading into these hills. We will find the murdering witch. The word struck Marianne like a physical blow. A choked gasp escaped her, and she began to tremble uncontrollably. The men were close, just on the other side of the creek bed. A stray beam from a lantern cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees not 20 yards from their hiding place. Eli reacted without thinking. He grabbed the front of her dress and pulled her down, pushing her behind him, flat against the damp earth. Then he threw his heavy wool coat over her, covering her completely. "Do not move," he breathed, his mouth next to her ear. "Do not make a sound." He drew his Colt, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. He lay beside her, shielded by the log, peering through a small gap in the roots. He could see them now. 3 riders, their slickers gleaming in the lantern light. They were hard-looking men, their faces grim. They stopped, their horses blowing and stamping in the mud. "This is useless," one of them grumbled. "We will catch our death in this rain. She is probably already coyote food." "Silas Holt was my cousin," another man spat. "I am not stopping until I see her swinging from a rope. Grady wants her back, dead or alive." They argued for another minute, their voices rising and falling on the wind. "Under the coat." Marianne was shaking so hard Eli could feel the vibrations through the ground. He could feel her terror as if it were his own. A cold, sickening dread that tightened his chest. He felt a surge of something hot and protective, an anger so fierce it surprised him. These men, so sure of their righteousness, hunting a woman like an animal. Finally, the man who seemed to be the leader made a decision. "We will make for the old trapper's cabin come morning. If she is anywhere in these hills, she might head there. We will ride on for now. Try to find some cover." The riders moved on, their voices and the sound of their horses fading into the night and the rain. Eli waited, his gun still raised, listening until he was sure they were gone. He waited a full 5 minutes more before he finally relaxed, letting out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He pulled the coat off Marianne. She was curled into a tight ball, her face buried in her arms. She was still trembling. He expected relief, maybe even gratitude. Instead, when he spoke, his voice was a low, angry rasp. That was close, too close. He shoved his pistol back into its holster with more force than was necessary. "You see what you have done? You have brought them down on me. I've got men with ropes hunting me now, all for a woman who will not even tell me if she is guilty or not." His anger was a shield, a wall he threw up to hide the raw fear that had gripped him when that lantern light had swept near. The fear had not been for himself. It had been for her. The thought of those men finding her, of what they would do to her. It had turned his blood to ice. He could not stand the feeling. He hated the vulnerability of it, hated her for making him feel it. Marianne slowly uncurled. She sat up, her face pale and streaked with tears and dirt. She looked at him, and her eyes were not fearful or apologetic. They were filled with a cold, weary anger that matched his own. "I never asked for your help," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I never asked you to risk your life. You can leave me right now. Go. It is what you wanted to do from the beginning." Her words stung because they were true. He turned away from her, staring out at the rain-swept darkness, his own hypocrisy bitter in his mouth. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine and damp earth. The sky was a pale, fragile blue. They packed their few belongings in a tense, brittle silence. The anger from the night before had not dissipated. It had settled between them, a cold, heavy weight. They stopped by a small, clear-running stream to fill their canteens, while Eli checked on Dust. Marianne knelt by the water's edge. She cupped her hands and splashed water on her face, trying to scrub away the days of grime. She worked at a stubborn knot in her hair, her reflection a blurry, distorted image in the moving water. Eli finished with the horse and turned, and, for a moment, he just watched her. The morning light caught in her wet hair, turning it the color of rich mahogany, with some of the dirt washed away. He could see the fine, strong line of her jaw, the surprising delicacy of her features. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but he also saw the resilience, the iron core that had refused to break. He was not looking at a problem or a memory of someone else. He was looking at Marianne Holt, and in that unguarded moment, he felt a strange, unwelcome pull, a recognition of the woman herself, separate from her past and his own. She must have felt his gaze, because she looked up and her eyes met his in her reflection. She saw the way he was looking at her, a look of unguarded appraisal, and her expression hardened. She looked down at her torn, filthy dress, at her raw hands. "Do not look at me like I am clean," she said, her voice low and sharp, laced with a self-loathing that cut him to the quick. The words hung in the clean morning air. He could have said something kind, something reassuring, but kindness was a language he no longer spoke fluently. His own guilt and confusion were a knot in his throat. He looked from her reflection to her face, his expression unreadable. "I never said you were," he replied quietly. The words were not meant to be cruel, but they landed with the force of a slap. He saw her flinch. He felt it himself, a sharp pang in his own chest. It was a brutal piece of honesty, an acknowledgement of the dirt on both of them, hers literal, his buried deeper. They were two broken, tarnished people, hiding in the wilderness, running from the ghosts of their pasts. His words were a confession and an accusation all at once, revealing the ugly, tangled mess of guilt and attraction that had grown between them in the silence. She looked away first, her shoulders slumping. He turned and walked back to the horse. The moment was broken, but something had been forged in it, something hard and real and painful. They rode on, deeper into the hills. The terrain grew more rugged, the pine forests thicker. Late that afternoon, as they crested a ridge, Eli pulled the horse to a halt. Below them, nestled in a small, hidden valley, was a cabin. It was small and rough-hewn, with a stone chimney and a sagging porch. A thin trickle of smoke rose from the chimney, but it was not from a fire. It was the slow, steady decay of a long-abandoned place. "A trapper's cabin," Eli said. "The one those men were talking about." They made their way down the steep incline. The cabin was old but solid. The door hung on one hinge, and the single window was shuttered, but the roof looked sound. Inside, it was dusty and filled with the debris of a hasty departure, but it was 4 walls and a roof. It was a shelter, a place to stop running. "We will stay here," Eli announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "At least for a while. Let the hunt die down." Marianne slid off the horse without waiting for his help. She stood before the dilapidated cabin, her new home, her new prison. She looked at the cabin, then at the vast, empty wilderness surrounding them, and then at the quiet, scarred man who was her unwilling protector. She gave a slow nod. For now, this was their world. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm, a fragile truce governed by necessity and the vast, silent wilderness that held them captive. The passing days wove a routine between them, a pattern of shared survival that required few words. Eli would rise before dawn, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and slip out with his rifle. He was a hunter by nature, quiet and patient, and he always returned with something for the pot, a rabbit, a brace of grouse, and once a small deer that would feed them for a week. Marianne, in turn, became the keeper of the hearth. She had swept the years of dust and debris from the single room, using a broom fashioned from a pine branch. She scrubbed the grime from the small iron stove until it shone a dull black, and she learned its temperament, coaxing a steady, life-giving warmth from it. She cooked what he brought back, stretching their meager supplies with a quiet ingenuity, making stews that were thin but hot, filling the small space with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. She was the one who tended the fire, ensuring it never went out, for the fire was their shield against the encroaching cold and the deep, listening dark. Autumn bled its colors from the aspens, leaving them stark and skeletal against the deepening blue of the sky. Then the first snow came. It fell silently in the night, a soft white blanket that transformed their world. When they woke, the valley was hushed, every sharp edge softened, every sound muffled. The pines wore heavy coats of white, their branches bowed. The world outside their small window was beautiful and deadly, a pristine wilderness that would kill them without a second thought. The snow deepened, isolating them completely. Their world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the path to the creek, and the silent, watchful forest. The smoke that curled from their stone chimney was the only sign of human life for 100 miles, a thin, gray pillar of defiance against the immense white landscape. To Eli, it felt like a secret signal, a whisper to the empty sky that they were still alive. But it was also a beacon, and he found himself watching the ridge lines, his hand never far from his gun, knowing that same smoke could betray them to any searching eyes. Nights were the longest. The cold was a physical presence that pressed against the log walls and breathed through the chinks they had stuffed with mud and moss. It was then that the sound of the wolves began. It would start with a single, mournful cry that rose from the valley, a sound of pure, desolate loneliness. Then another would answer, and another, until the night was filled with their chorus. Marianne would sit closer to the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the flames. Eli would watch her, saying nothing, the howling a fitting soundtrack to the isolation that had become their lives. In the quiet confines of the cabin, a slow, hesitant intimacy began to form, built not on words but on small, necessary actions. One evening, Marianne noticed a long tear in the sleeve of Eli's shirt, where it had snagged on a branch. Without a word, she took a small sewing kit from her meager bundle, a kit she had clung to from her old life, and began to mend it. He sat across from her at the rough-hewn table, watching the way the firelight caught in her hair as she bent over her work. Her fingers, no longer bruised and raw, but still chapped from the cold and harsh soap, moved with a steady, focused grace. She was not just patching a shirt. She was mending a small tear in the fabric of their fractured existence. When she finished, she held it out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing, and the simple touch was like a spark in the cold air. "Thank you," he murmured, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. A few days later, he spent the afternoon working on her side of the cabin. She had been sleeping on a pile of dry leaves that rustled and scattered with every movement. He gathered armfuls of fresh, fragrant pine boughs and built a thick, springy base. On top of this, he spread a deep layer of clean hay he found in the small, dilapidated lean-to. He took his own bedroll and spread it over the hay, leaving himself with just a single blanket. He did not explain the gesture. He simply did it. That night, when Marianne lay down, the soft comfort of the makeshift bed was a profound and unexpected kindness. It was more than a place to sleep. It was an acknowledgement. He saw her. He saw her discomfort and had chosen to ease it. She lay awake for a long time, listening to his steady breathing from the other side of the room, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The cold deepened. Winter took hold of the mountains with an iron grip. One night, a blizzard descended, a howling vortex of wind and snow that shook the cabin to its foundations. They could not see past the window. They were marooned. Two souls adrift in a sea of white. Eli had a half-full bottle of whiskey in his saddlebag, saved for snakebite or a deep wound. That night, he brought it out. "It will warm the blood," he said, pouring a measure into 2 tin cups. The whiskey was raw and fiery, and it burned a trail of warmth down their throats. They drank in silence for a while, watching the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. The liquor worked on them, loosening the tightly knotted cords of restraint and fear. It was Marianne who spoke first, her voice quiet, almost lost in the shriek of the wind. "Why are you alone, Eli?" The question was a stone dropped into a still, deep pool. He had expected her to ask about the men hunting them, about their chances of survival, about anything but him. He swirled the whiskey in his cup, staring into the amber liquid as if he could find an answer there. He had not spoken of his past to anyone in years. The words were rust-locked. "A man like you," she continued softly, when he did not answer. "Quiet and capable. You should have a wife, a family." He took a long swallow of whiskey, the fire of it giving him a strange courage. He looked not at her, but at the flames. "I did," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "Or I was going to—" He paused, and the only sound was the wind and the crackle of pine logs. "Her name was Clara," he said, the name feeling like a ghost on his tongue. "Her father owned a small ranch over in the next territory. She was not like anyone I had ever known. She saw things in me I did not know were there." He fell silent again, lost in the memory. He saw her face, the way she smiled, the light in her eyes when she looked at him. "What happened to her?" Marianne asked, her voice gentle, careful. "Fire," he said, the word coming out like a piece of rock. "There was a feud over water rights with a neighbor, a man named Jedediah Stone. Mean, bitter man. One night, things got ugly. Words were exchanged, threats. I was away, riding for her father, moving a herd. I should have been there." He stopped, his knuckles white around his cup. The next night, Stone and his sons rode over. They were drunk, looking for a fight. No one knows exactly how it started. But they set fire to the barn. The wind was high that night. It jumped to the house in minutes. "A tinderbox." His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. A recitation of facts that had burned themselves into his soul. By the time I saw the smoke and got back, it was too late. The whole place was an inferno. She was trapped inside. He fell silent. He did not tell her about the screaming, or the smell of burning pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet. He did not tell her about how he had tried to run into the flames, how Clara's father had held him back, saving his life while his own daughter perished. He did not tell her about the consuming, soul-deep guilt that had been his only companion ever since. The guilt of a man who had not been there to protect the woman he loved. He drained his cup and stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. Marianne watched him, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. She saw the raw, gaping wound his words had exposed. She saw the source of his haunted eyes, of the impenetrable wall he kept around himself. Her expression, which had been so often guarded and fearful, softened into something else, something akin to understanding. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of his confession. Then she took a breath. "I did not kill him," she whispered. Eli did not move, but he heard her. He felt the words land in the charged air between them. "My husband," she clarified, her voice trembling slightly. "I did not murder him, not the way they say." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "But I did kill him." Eli finally turned his head to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes huge and dark. "He came home that night. He had been drinking in town. He was in one of his rages. It was about money. It was always about money. He said I was costing him too much, that I was a useless burden." She swallowed hard, the memory vivid and ugly. "He came at me. He had done it before, but this time was different. There was something in his eyes, a decision. He said he was going to shut my mouth for good. Her voice dropped lower, becoming ragged. He put his hands around my throat. I could not breathe. I was clawing at his arms. But he was so strong. I could feel everything going dark. The lantern was on the mantelpiece beside me, a heavy brass one. I do not even remember reaching for it. It was just in my hand. I swung it as hard as I could. She began to tremble, a deep, violent shudder that shook her whole body. He made this sound, a horrible surprise sound, and he just fell. His hands let go of my throat. He hit his head on the stone hearth. There was so much blood. He did not move again. I did not hit him while he was sleeping. I did not push him. He was trying to kill me, and I stopped him. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, desperate for him to believe her, to absolve her. I did not want him dead. I just wanted him to stop. Eli listened to her entire story without a flicker of expression. He heard the terror and the truth in her voice. It fit with what he knew of Silas Holt. It fit with the bruises he had first seen on her wrists. It felt real, but he had been lied to before. He had seen how desperation could make a person say anything. The world was a treacherous place, and belief was a dangerous currency to spend. He said nothing. He simply turned his gaze back to the fire, torn between the instinct to believe her desperate confession and the hard-won habit of trusting no one. His silence was a judgment she could not read, a void that was worse than any accusation. The tension in the cabin became unbearable, a suffocating pressure. The intimacy of their confessions had not brought them closer. It had stretched the wire between them to the breaking point. Eli stood up abruptly, the legs of his stool scraping loudly against the rough floorboards. "I will sleep outside," he said, his voice gruff. He reached for his coat. He needed air. He needed distance. He needed to escape the look in her eyes and the truth of what they had both just admitted. He moved toward the door, but she was there before him, blocking his path. She stood small and defiant in the flickering firelight. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "Do not, please." "Get out of the way. Marianne." "No." She looked up at him, her face a mess of tear tracks and desperate resolve. She had just laid her soul bare, confessed the darkest moment of her life. She could not bear for him to walk away from her now. To be left alone with that horror was more than she could stand. Her hands came up and gripped the front of his shirt. "You will be my last," she said, the words a raw, trembling whisper. It was not a proposition. It was a statement of utter desperation, a plea, a claim. She had nothing else. No home, no name, no future. There was only him. "Say it," she insisted, her grip tightening. "I need you to say it." He looked down at her wild, pleading eyes, at her trembling lips. He saw all of her fear, her loneliness, her brokenness reflected there. And in it, he saw his own. Two damned souls, clinging to wreckage in a storm. He felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. He did not answer at first. The wind howled outside, a lonely, searching sound. Then he leaned down, his forehead almost touching hers, and the word escaped him. A ghost of a sound, a surrender. "You will be my last." The next morning, the blizzard had passed. A pristine, unblemished world of white greeted them. They went down to the river, a place now edged with ice, the water running dark and cold beneath it. The air was sharp and clean. What had passed between them in the cabin the night before lingered, a silent, powerful current. There, by the river's edge, with the snow-laden pines standing as silent witnesses, he reached for her. It was not a moment of sudden, fiery passion. It was slow and tender and deeply sad. It was a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death. His touch was hesitant, gentle, as if he were holding something infinitely fragile. Her response was a quiet, desperate clinging, a need for a human anchor in the vast, cold emptiness of her world. It was more about survival than desire, an act of mutual comfort between two people who had lost everything else. It was a mercy. It was a sin. They were not sure which. Afterward, as they stood apart, the cold morning air seeping back between them, guilt settled upon them both like a shroud. The intimacy had solved nothing. It had only deepened the complication, tangling them together in a way that words and shared stories never could. They had crossed a line, and neither of them knew if the land on the other side was a sanctuary or just another, more dangerous kind of wilderness. Winter's grip did not so much break as it did slowly, grudgingly dissolve. The change came first as a sound, the steady drip of melting icicles, which grew into the murmur of running water under the snow. And finally, the full-throated roar of the creek as it swelled with snowmelt, its banks overflowing. The sun, a distant, watery presence for months, gained a new strength, and its warmth coaxed the first hints of green from the sleeping earth. For the first time in a long time, the air did not hurt to breathe. The change in the season brought a subtle shift inside the cabin as well. The oppressive intimacy of their shared winter confinement eased with the lengthening days. The guilt that had shadowed them after their desperate moment of connection remained. But it was a quieter thing now, a layer of scar tissue over a wound. They moved around each other with a careful, learned grace. They spoke more, their conversations no longer limited to the bare necessities of survival, but sometimes drifting to small, inconsequential things. The taste of the first wild onions he found, the shape of a hawk circling high overhead. A fragile, unspoken peace had settled between them. It felt dangerously close to hope. But spring is a season of uncovering what has been buried, and hope is a fragile thing in a hard country. The danger, when it returned, came on a bright, deceptively peaceful afternoon. Eli was splitting firewood, the rhythmic crack of the axe the only sound in the valley. When he felt it, a shift in the air, a wrongness. He froze, axe in mid-swing, and listened. Then he heard it, the jingle of a harness, the low plod of horses. He dropped the axe and was inside the cabin in 2 strides. "Get back," he ordered Marianne, his voice a low command. "Away from the window." She saw the look on his face, and her blood went cold. She scrambled to the back of the cabin as Eli pulled his rifle from its pegs above the door and took a position by the shuttered window, peering through a thin crack. 4 riders were making their way down into the valley. They were not moving with caution. They rode with the unhurried confidence of men who knew their destination and expected no resistance. Eli recognized the man in the lead. He was a big, broad-shouldered man with a cruel set to his mouth. It was Grady, the foreman from the Double H Ranch. They pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, their horses blowing after the long ride. "Holt's woman!" Grady's voice boomed, echoing in the quiet valley. "We know you are in there. So is that drifter, Carter. We saw your smoke for weeks. Come on out. The circuit judge is finally in Harmony Creek, and he is eager to hear your side of things." The man's tone was thick with a sarcasm that was more threatening than any shout. Eli remained silent, his rifle steady. "Do not make us come in for you," Grady continued, his hand drifting to the pistol at his hip. "We just want the woman. The man can ride on. No one needs to get hurt."
"He is lying,"
Marianne whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. Eli knew he was. These were not men of the law. They were a lynch mob with a patient streak. "That is far enough. Grady!" Eli called out, his voice clear and steady. "You have no authority here. Turn your horses around and ride out." Grady let out a harsh laugh. "I got all the authority I need right here." He patted his gun. One of the other men, a lanky youth with nervous eyes, unholstered his own pistol. "This is your last warning," Eli said, his voice dropping, taking on a cold, flat edge. "Leave now." After what you did to my cousin Silas? Grady sneered. That witch is gonna hang. And if you stand in the way, Carter, we will hang you right beside her. He nodded to the lanky man. Go get her. The young man hesitated for a second, then spurred his horse forward, his gun raised uncertainly. He was a fool, and his foolishness was about to get him hurt. Eli did not aim for the chest. He was not a murderer. He aimed for the leg. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon's peace. The lanky rider cried out, a high, sharp sound of pain and surprise, and toppled from his saddle, his pistol flying from his grasp. His horse shied violently and bolted. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Grady and the other two men cursed and scrambled for cover, firing their pistols wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded into the log walls, sending splinters flying. Get your things, Eli yelled at Marianne over the gunfire. We are leaving now! He laid down covering fire. One shot, then another, forcing the men to keep their heads down. Marianne was already moving, stuffing their meager belongings. A blanket, the last of the dried venison, a tin cup into a saddlebag. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were swift. The fragile peace of their life had been shattered, and the old, familiar terror was back. Sharp and sickening. Eli fired one last shot toward the rocks where Grady was hiding, then darted back from the window. The back way! Go! He had worked on the cabin's back wall, loosening a log just big enough to crawl through in case of just such an emergency. He pushed it aside and scrambled through, rifle in hand. Marianne followed, her face pale but her jaw set. They ran, low to the ground, into the cover of the thick pine forest as angry shouts and more gunshots echoed behind them. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had crossed a line. He had shot a man, however justified, and now the law, real or otherwise, would hunt him too. They fled. There was no other word for it. They ran until their lungs burned, then scrambled onto Dust, who Eli had left hobbled in a small grove, and rode without stopping. They did not follow a trail. They plunged through the untamed wilderness, through dense forests of fir and across rivers still swollen and dangerously cold with snowmelt. The icy water bit at their skin and soaked them to the bone, but they pushed on. Fear was a spur, driving them deeper into the mountains. For 2 days, they moved as if the devil himself were on their heels. They ate in the saddle, slept in short, fitful bursts, always with one ear open for the sound of pursuit. The strain began to wear on Marianne. Her face grew gaunt, and dark circles bloomed beneath her eyes. On the 3rd night, as they huddled under a granite overhang, the sound of a cold rain drumming on the rock above them, she finally broke her silence. "You have to leave me, Eli," she said, her voice a low, ragged whisper. He was staring into the darkness, his rifle across his lap. He did not turn to look at her. "Do not be a fool." "I am not," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "It is me they want. It has always been me. They only shot at you because you were protecting me. If you leave me, you can get away. You can find a place where no one knows your name." "And what would you do?" he asked, his voice flat. "Let them find you. Let them take you back and put a rope around your neck?" "It would be my fate, not yours," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You have suffered enough on my account. You shot a man for me. Your life is ruined because of me. Please, Eli, save yourself." He finally turned to look at her. In the dim reflected light from the wet rocks, her face was a pale oval, her eyes pleading. He saw her trying to be noble, trying to cut him loose from the trouble she believed she had caused. He saw her trying to save him, just as he had saved her. The irony was a bitter thing. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "We are past that now. Your fate is my fate. What is done is done." He looked away. toward the dark, empty wilderness that surrounded them, the wilderness that was both their prison and their sanctuary. "If they hang you," he said, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear him over the rain, "they will have to hang me too." The words were stark, devoid of any romance. A simple statement of fact, but to Marianne, they were the most profound declaration he could have made. He was not just her protector, he was her partner in this. Their fates were bound together, for better or for worse. She leaned her head against his arm, and for the first time since they had fled the cabin, she allowed herself to cry, silent tears of terror and a strange, heartbreaking gratitude. They found refuge in a narrow, winding canyon, a deep scar in the earth with walls so high the sun only reached the bottom for an hour at noon. It was a defensible place, a place to catch their breath. But the cost of their flight had been high. During their desperate crossing of a fast-moving river, Marianne had been thrown from the horse, her legs scraping hard against a submerged rock. At the time, with adrenaline pumping through her, it had seemed a minor injury. Now, in the damp, cold confines of the canyon, it began to fester. The wound, a long, ugly gash on her shin, turned an angry red. A fever set in. At first, it was just a slight chill, a shivering she could not control. But within a day, it had become a raging fire. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She began to drift, lost in a delirium of disjointed memories and fears. She would cry out for him, her voice thin and reedy, even when he was sitting right beside her. Eli felt a cold, familiar dread settle in his gut. He was a man who knew how to survive. He could hunt, track, and fight, but this was an enemy he could not shoot, a foe he could not outrun. He did what he could. He kept a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. He coaxed sips of water between her cracked lips. He sat with her through the long, dark nights, listening to her fevered murmurs, his own helplessness a heavy weight in his chest. He was losing her, just as he had lost Clara. The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. After 2 days, he knew she could not stay in the canyon. The dampness was making it worse. She needed warmth, and he needed to clean the wound properly. Under the faint light of a crescent moon, he lifted her into his arms. She was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder, her breathing shallow. He carried her out of the canyon, her feverish heat soaking through his shirt. He walked through the night, his own exhaustion forgotten, driven by a single, desperate purpose, to find a safe place, to save her life. He found it just before dawn, a small, hidden cove by a secluded stretch of river, sheltered by a grove of ancient, weeping willows. He laid her down gently on a bed of soft moss. The infection in her leg was worse. The skin around the wound was dark and swollen. He knew what he had to do. He had to wash it, to clean out the poison that was killing her. He built a small, smokeless fire and heated water in his tin cup. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt, the cleanest cloth he had. He knelt beside her. Her dress was caked with mud and river grime. To get to the wound, to clean it properly, he would have to remove it. His hands, which could skin a deer or aim a rifle with unwavering steadiness, began to shake. This felt like a greater violation than any violence, a more profound intimacy than any touch they had shared. He unfastened the buttons at her throat, his fingers clumsy and slow. He eased the rough, wet fabric from her shoulders, his gaze fixed on her face, on the feverish flush of her cheeks, on anything but her body. He worked with a desperate, fearful reverence, peeling away the layers of her dress, her chemise, until she lay before him, vulnerable and unconscious in the pale morning light. He dipped the cloth in the warm water and began to clean the wound. His touch was as gentle as he could make it, his movements careful and precise. He washed away the grime and the sickness, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment was charged with 1,000 unspoken things. His fear for her life was tangled with a deep, aching tenderness that felt dangerously like love. Every gentle touch was a confession. Every careful movement was a plea to whatever God might be listening. In the middle of his careful work, her eyes fluttered open. They were lucid for a moment, the fever haze receding. She looked at him, at his shaking hands, at the raw concern etched on his face. She understood what he was doing, the intimacy of the care he was giving her. A single tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her hair. "I wish," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "I wish I had met you before all this, before my life went wrong." The simple, heartbreaking words broke through the last of his defenses. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his own eyes burning. All the things he had never been able to say, all the feelings he had crushed and denied, rose up in him. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, and spoke the words that had become their strange and sacred vow. "You will be my last," he told her softly. It was not forced from him this time. It was not a surrender. It was a promise. It was the truest thing he had ever said. She closed her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips, and slipped back into the fever sleep. He finished cleaning and bandaging her leg, then covered her with his coat and every blanket they had. As she slept, her breathing seeming a little easier now, he sat beside her, watching the current of the dark river. He looked up at the stars, scattered like diamonds on black velvet, and for the first time, he wondered if redemption was possible. He had failed Clara, but perhaps the universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had given him a second chance in the form of this stubborn, broken, beautiful woman. He began to plan. He let himself think beyond the next sunrise, beyond the next ridgeline. Maybe they could make it south, across the border. In Mexico, they would be just another man and woman, their pasts erased, their names unknown, or maybe north, into the high, empty country where a person could disappear forever. He imagined a small piece of land, a cabin that was theirs, a life of peace, a future. The idea, so impossible just weeks ago, took root in his heart, a tiny, fragile seed of hope, planted by a river's edge in the dead of night. For 2 days, hope was a tangible thing, as real as the gentle warmth of the spring sun on their skin. Marianne's fever broke, leaving her weak and trembling, but alive. The infection in her leg began to recede, the angry red softening to a dull pink. She slept, a deep, healing sleep, and Eli sat watch, his heart filled with a quiet, fierce relief that was entirely new to him. The seed of a future he had planted in his mind began to sprout. On the third morning, she was strong enough to sit up and drink broth he made from a rabbit. She watched him as he moved about their small camp, his actions economical and sure. The hardened lines around his eyes seemed to have softened. He was still a quiet man, but his silence no longer felt like a wall between them. "Mexico," he said, his back to her as he cleaned his rifle. The word was dropped so casually into the morning air that for a moment, she was not sure she had heard it correctly. "What?" He turned, a rare, faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "That is my plan. We get you strong enough to ride, and we head south, cross the border, find a place where the name Holt means nothing, and the name Carter is just another name." He looked at her, his gaze direct and steady. "We could get a small piece of land, build a house, a real one." Marianne stared at him, her heart aching with a feeling so powerful it almost frightened her. A house, a life. It was a dream she had not dared to even imagine. After all the running, all the fear, the idea of a place to simply be was a paradise she could barely comprehend. "Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He looked away, uncomfortable with the depth of emotion in her eyes. "Just a thought," he muttered. But it was not just a thought. It was a promise. It was the future, laid out before them like a map to a hidden country. Hope, however, makes a man careless. It makes him believe the world can be kind. The world is rarely kind. Tragedy did not arrive with a warning. It came with the dawn, crashing into their fragile peace with the force of a rock slide. Eli was by the river, gathering fresh water. When the first shot rang out, the bullet splintered the bark of a willow tree inches from his head. He dropped the canteen and drew his Colt in a single, fluid motion, diving for the cover of the riverbank. Grady, it had to be. Another shot, this one kicking up dirt where he had just been standing. He peered over the bank. He could see them at the edge of the trees. 5 of them this time, dismounted and spreading out. They had found them. All his planning, all his hope, turned to ash in an instant. His first and only thought was of Marianne. She was in the open, by the fire, still too weak to run. He had to draw them away from her. It was the only chance she had. "Marianne!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. "The reeds! Hide!" He fired 2 quick shots toward the tree line, not aiming to hit, but to draw their fire, to make himself the target. It worked. The men's attention snapped to him, and a volley of gunfire erupted in his direction. Bullets chewed at the mudbank, whining past his ears. He saw her scramble, half crawling, toward the thicket of cattails and reeds that lined the river's edge. He prayed she would be quick enough. "He is over there," Grady's voice roared. "Get the bastard!" Eli broke from cover, running downstream, staying low. He was a moving target now, a desperate gamble. A bullet tore through the flesh of his left arm. A hot, searing pain. He ignored it. He kept running, firing back, leading the hunt away from the cove, away from her. He reached a bend in the river, glanced back, and saw that the men were following, crashing through the underbrush after him. Good. He was focused on the men in front of him, on the next piece of cover. He never saw the 5th man, the one who had circled around. A rifle cracked from the side, and a sledgehammer of force slammed into his back, just below the shoulder blade. The world tilted violently. His legs gave out, and he pitched forward, his face hitting the cold river water. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was Grady's triumphant shout. Marianne watched it all from her hiding place in the reeds. She had seen him run, had seen him deliberately draw their fire. She had seen him fall. A scream built in her throat, but she choked it down, turning it into a silent, agonizing sob. She pressed her face into the damp earth, her body shaking. She could hear the men crashing through the woods, their voices getting closer. They were looking for his body. "Did you get him?" "He went down in the water, right over there." She had to do something. She could not let them find him. With a strength born of pure terror, she crawled through the reeds, the water cold and shocking against her skin. She found him half submerged, his face in the mud, a dark cloud of blood spreading in the water around him. He was breathing, the shallowest of breaths. She hooked her arms under his, pulling with all her might. He was a dead weight, but somehow she managed to drag him deeper into the reeds, into a thick, tangled patch where the water was shallow. She propped his head up on a tussock of grass. Out of the water, his face was ashen, his eyes closed. "Eli," she whispered, her tears falling on his still face. "Oh, God, Eli." The men's voices were right at the river's edge now. "I do not see him. The current must have taken him. Spread out. He cannot have gone far. Wounded like that, he will bleed out soon enough." They began to search the riverbank, their boots squelching in the mud. They were getting closer to the reeds, closer to him, Marianne knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as ice, that they would find him, and they would finish the job. In that moment, a decision formed in her mind, a terrible, clear-headed act of sacrifice. There was only one way to save him, only one way to call off the hunt. She had to give them what they had come for. She took one last look at Eli's pale, unconscious face. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead. Then, she stood up. She pushed aside the reeds and walked out onto the riverbank. into the full morning light. She held her hands up, palms forward, showing they were empty. Grady and his men stopped dead in their tracks, their guns half raised. They stared at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and triumph.
"I am here,"
she said, her voice shaking but clear.
"It is me you want. Let him go. Just let him be."
Grady slowly lowered his rifle, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Well, look what the river coughed up," he said. "The Black Widow herself." He gestured with his rifle. "Tie her up, boys. We're going back to town." They bound her hands roughly behind her back and dragged her away from the river. She did not look back. She could not bear to. She focused all her will on walking, on putting one foot in front of the other, on the single, desperate hope that her sacrifice had bought Eli Carter enough time to live. The journey back to Harmony Creek was a nightmare of jeers and rough handling. When they arrived, the whole town seemed to be waiting. Faces stared at her from doorways and windows, faces filled with a grim, righteous satisfaction. They hated her. She realized they had despised her powerful, cruel husband. But they hated her more. She was the woman who had stepped out of line, who had, in their minds, committed the ultimate sin of raising a hand against her provider, her owner. They did not put her in the town's flimsy jail cell. They locked her in a storage room at the back of the saloon. And there, her trial began. It was not a trial of law, but a trial of public opinion, held in the court of a smoky, whiskey-soaked room. The circuit judge, a man named Ferris with a face like sour milk and an eye for the town's most powerful citizens, presided. Grady was the star witness. He told a story of a brave posse tracking a cold-blooded killer. He told them how the man she had run off with, Eli Carter, had ambushed them, shooting young Jedediah Stone in the leg. "That boy died, you know," Grady said, his voice ringing with false piety. "Died of a fever from the wound 2 weeks later. So Carter is a murderer too." The lie spread through the room like a contagion. Eli had not killed anyone. He had shot a man in self-defense, but the story was better this way. It made them heroes and made Eli a devil. Then Grady described the final shootout, painting Eli as a crazed animal and Marianne as the serpent who had lured him to his doom. "He is dead now," Grady concluded. "Fell in the river. We saw him go down. Good riddance." No one spoke in her defense. The judge listened, nodding grimly. He looked at Marianne, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The sentence was death. She would be hanged in the town square in 3 days' time. The men in the saloon cheered. They had their wish. Justice would be served. Meanwhile, miles away, a dead man was clawing his way back to life. Eli woke to the feeling of drowning. His lungs were on fire, full of river water. He coughed, a violent body-racking spasm that sent waves of agony through his wounded back. He vomited water and bile into the reeds. For a long time, he just lay there, floating between a black unconsciousness and a red haze of pain. Marianne. The thought of her was the only thing that cut through the fog. They had her. He had to get to her. He did not know how long he lay there. Hours, maybe a day. He finally managed to push himself up, his body screaming in protest. The wound in his back was a galaxy of pain. He was weak from blood loss. His clothes were soaked, and a burning fever was beginning to take hold. But he had to move. His journey back to Harmony Creek was a descent into hell. It was not a ride, not even a walk. It was a crawl, a stagger, a relentless forward lurch fueled by nothing but sheer will. He fell countless times. He drank from muddy puddles. He ate a handful of bitter roots he recognized, his stomach heaving them back up. He moved through a blur of pain and fever dreams. In his delirium, he saw Clara's face, her eyes filled with pity. He saw Marianne, her hands outstretched, calling his name. They were the ghosts that drove him on. the twin flames of his guilt and his hope. Days bled together. He lost track of time. He just knew he had to get to the town. He finally stumbled onto a road he recognized. He followed it, a lurching, half-dead specter, leaving a trail of blood and broken footprints in the dust. He arrived in Harmony Creek on the morning of the third day. The sun was just rising, casting long, grim shadows across the main street. The entire town was gathered in the square. In the center of the square, stark against the morning sky, stood a newly built gallows. And on that gallows, with a rope around her neck, was Marianne. The sight of her jolted him out of his fever haze, focusing all his remaining strength into a single point of cold, clear rage. They were going to kill her. After everything, after all their running, they were going to murder her in front of this silent, watching crowd. He saw the sheriff, a portly man with a tin star, standing by the lever. He saw Grady, standing near the steps of the scaffold, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Eli did not shout. He did not issue a challenge. He had walked out of his own grave, and he had no more words left. He drew the Colt that had, by some miracle, remained in its holster. He took a steadying breath, his vision swimming. He had one chance, one last fight. He raised the pistol and fired. The first shot took the sheriff in the arm, spinning him around and away from the lever. The crowd screamed, a single, collective cry of shock and terror. All eyes turned to the figure at the edge of the square, a man who looked more like a corpse than a living being, covered in dried blood and mud, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "Carter!" Grady yelled, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He drew his own gun. "He is alive!" The world exploded into a chaotic whirlwind of gunfire. Eli moved with a strange, dreamlike grace, the pain forgotten, his body fueled by pure adrenaline. He fired again, and Grady staggered back, a red flower blooming on his chest, his expression of smugness replaced by one of final surprise. Another of the posse members raised a rifle. Eli shot him before he could aim. He was a specter of vengeance, his gun bucking in his hand, his aim impossibly true, but he was one man, grievously wounded, against many. A bullet slammed into his side, staggering him. Another tore through his leg, and he went down to one knee. He tried to raise his pistol for one last shot, but his strength was gone. In the confusion, as the crowd scattered and the posse was focused on the dying man in the street, no one was watching Marianne. She did not hesitate. She wrenched her hands free from the loose binding, pulled the rough, heavy noose from over her head, and jumped from the gallows. She ran to him. She ignored the last few stray shots, ignored the shouting men. She saw only him, kneeling in the dust. She reached him just as he collapsed, his gun falling from his nerveless fingers. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, oblivious to the blood that soaked her dress. The street was suddenly quiet, the gunfight over as quickly as it had begun. The rising sun bathed them in a soft, golden light. He was bleeding from a half-dozen places, his life pouring out into the dusty street, but he was looking at her. His eyes, though clouded with pain, were clear. He saw that she was safe. He had done it. He had kept his unspoken promise. A faint smile touched his lips. He raised a trembling hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. "Marianne," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. She leaned down, pressing her tear-streaked face against his. "I am here, Eli," she sobbed. "I am here." He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, he saw the home he had been searching for all his life. "You will be my last," he said, one final time. His hand fell away. His eyes glazed over, and as the sun climbed higher into the sky, Eli Carter died in her arms. The roar of the gunfight faded into an unnerving silence. The morning sun, now clear of the horizon, cast a clean, unforgiving light on the dusty street, illuminating the two dead men of the posse and the crumpled form of Eli Carter. The crowd, which had gathered for the spectacle of an execution, had gotten a different kind of bloodletting. They stood frozen for a long moment, a silent ring of witnesses, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, sober shame. They had come to see a woman hang, and had instead watched a man die for her. Marianne did not notice them. Her world had shrunk to the space she occupied in the dirt, to the man whose head she held in her lap. His blood was warm on her hands, on her dress. His last breath had been a quiet sigh, a release. She felt the life leave him, a subtle lightening, as if the immense weight of his past, his grief, and his pain had finally been lifted from his shoulders. She held him, rocking gently, her silent tears tracing clean paths through the grime and blood on her cheeks. She did not wail. Her grief was too profound for sound, a hollow, silent cavern that had opened up inside her. One by one, the people of Harmony Creek began to drift away. They did not speak to her. They did not look at her. They simply turned their backs and retreated into their homes and shops, pulling their doors shut as if to close out the sight of what their judgment had wrought. The sheriff, clutching his bleeding arm, disappeared into his office. Soon, the square was empty. There was only her, the dead, and Eli's horse, Dust, who stood patiently at the edge of the square, his reins trailing in the dirt. She sat with him for hours as the sun climbed higher, its warmth a cruel mockery. She memorized the lines of his face, now peaceful in death. She traced the scar on his cheek, the stubborn set of his jaw. She remembered the rare, fleeting smiles that had transformed his haunted features. He had been a man forged by hardship and loss, a quiet, solitary soul who had, for some reason she would never fully understand, chosen to tether his fate to hers. He had saved her, not once, but over and over, and the final cost of her freedom had been his life. Finally, when the sun was directly overhead, she knew what she had to do. No one in this town would give him a proper burial. They would throw him in a potter's field, an unmarked grave for a man they had branded a murderer. She would not allow it. He deserved more. He deserved peace. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she managed to get his body onto the saddle of his loyal buckskin. It was a clumsy, heartbreaking struggle, but Dust stood rock steady, as if he understood. She wrapped Eli in his own coat, securing him as best she could. Then she retrieved his rifle and his hat from the street. She did not take a horse for herself. She took Dust's reins in her hand and began to walk, leading the horse out of the town that had condemned them both. People watched her go from behind drawn curtains. No one stopped her. No one offered a word of comfort or a word of condemnation. They simply let the ghost's bride, as they were already beginning to call her, lead her dead savior out into the wilderness. She walked for 2 days, back the way they had come, her mind a merciful blank, her body moving on pure, unthinking instinct. She followed the river, the water a constant, murmuring companion. She led him back to the very place where their story had begun, the small bend in the river where he had found a barefoot, terrified woman hiding in a willow thicket. There, under the shade of the cottonwoods, she began to dig. The ground was hard, a mix of rock and stubborn clay. She had no shovel, only his hunting knife and her bare hands. She worked until her fingers were raw and bleeding, until her muscles screamed in protest. She dug through the afternoon, through the cool of the evening, and into the night, guided by the pale light of the moon. She dug until the hole was deep enough, a proper grave, a final shelter. She gently lowered his body, wrapped in the last of their clean blankets, into the earth. She stood over him for a long time, the moonlight casting a silver sheen on her tear-streaked face. There were no prayers she knew to say, no final words that felt adequate. All she had was the memory of his voice, his promise. She filled the grave with her own hands, pushing the dirt back into place, patting it down until a low mound was formed. She found a large, smooth piece of driftwood by the river's edge, and spent the rest of the night painstakingly carving his name into it with the tip of his knife. Elicarter. She pushed the driftwood deep into the earth at the head of the grave. It was a simple marker for a simple, complicated man. Her work done. She collapsed beside the mound, her exhaustion complete, and slept under the stars. She woke to a world that was both achingly beautiful and profoundly empty. The land that had once seemed so threatening, so harsh, now felt different. It was still a wild, untamed place. But there was a peace to it she had not felt before. The morning sun warmed the new spring grass that bent and swayed in the gentle breeze. The river moved on, a constant, soothing presence, its current indifferent to the grief of a lone woman on its bank. This was the world he had given her. It was her inheritance, bought with his blood. Her grief was not a storm, but a quiet, persistent ache in her chest. For weeks, she did not stray far from the grave. She lived off the land as he had taught her, setting snares for rabbits, catching fish in the river with a line and hook she fashioned from her own hair and a piece of wire. She talked to him, her voice a low murmur that the wind carried away. She told him about her day, about the hawks she saw, about the taste of the wild berries she found. She knew he could not hear, but it did not matter. Speaking to him made the silence less absolute. One day, she knew she could not stay by the river forever. It was a place of beginnings and endings, but not a place to live. She had to go back to the one place that had ever felt like a home. She made the long journey back into the mountains, back to the hidden valley. When she arrived, she found the trapper's cabin in ruins. Grady's men had vented their frustration on it, kicking in the door, smashing the one window, and scattering the few things they had left behind. The sight of the violation was a fresh stab of pain. This was their place. But despair was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had survived a cruel husband, a lynch mob, and a wilderness that killed the weak. She would survive this. She began to rebuild. The work was her salvation. It was a physical manifestation of her will to live, a tribute to the man who had shown her how. She spent days repairing the door, using his knife to carve new wooden hinges. She found a piece of translucent, scraped hide to cover the window, letting in a soft, milky light. She chinked the logs with fresh mud and moss, sealing out the wind and the rain. She swept the floor clean, built a new hearth, and restacked the firewood. Each task was a prayer. Each mended board was a victory against the darkness that had tried to consume her. When the cabin was whole again, she turned her attention to the earth, by the riverbank, where the soil was rich and dark. She cleared a small patch of land. She had no seeds, so she walked for miles, gathering the tubers of wild onions and the seeds of hardy mountain grasses. She planted a small, humble garden. It was an act of pure, unadulterated hope. It was her planting roots in the land that was now hers. Time passed. Spring deepened into a lush, green summer. Her garden grew. She grew stronger, her body lean and tough from the work, her hands calloused and capable. Her face, once a mask of fear, settled into a look of quiet, sober resilience. She rarely thought of the world beyond her valley, but the world had not forgotten her. The story of Marianne Holt and the gunfighter who died for her had become a local legend. On the few occasions she had to travel to a distant trading post for salt or flour, she saw the way people looked at her. They would whisper amongst themselves, their eyes a mixture of fear and awe. Some said she was cursed, that she brought death to any man who came near her. Others, the more romantic souls, called her the ghost's bride, a woman who lived alone in the mountains, forever bound to the spirit of her dead lover. They gave her a wide berth. No one dared to approach her. The fear they had once tried to instill in her had been turned back on them. She was an outcast, a pariah, but she was also free. She was no longer a victim of their judgment. She was a myth. She was a survivor. One clear, cold night, as autumn began to touch the leaves with hints of gold and red. She walked down to the small garden by the river. The stars were brilliant in the black, moonless sky. So close she felt she could reach out and touch them. She sat on the bank, the cool earth beneath her, and looked up at the vast, silent expanse. She thought of him, as she always did in the quiet moments. She felt his presence not as a ghost, but as a part of the land itself, in the murmur of the river, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the steadfast presence of the mountains. She remembered his voice, his final promise, the words that had become the core of her new existence. She whispered them now to the listening stars, an echo, a vow, a statement of fact. You will be my last. She looked down at her own reflection in the dark, still water of the river. She saw a woman's face, etched with sorrow, but no longer with fear. She saw a strength she never knew she had. As she watched, a gentle breeze stirred the surface of the water, and her reflection wavered, breaking apart, merging with the slow, steady current. She was one with the river, one with the land, her love for him a silent, unspoken current that would flow on, beyond judgment, beyond death, eternal and unending. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are from so we can all connect, and feel free to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.